Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another tutorial. My name's Jake, and today we're going to be taking a look at this surfing on top of a car effect, which is actually overall pretty simple. So let's take a look at what we're going to be creating. There you go, not too bad. First, we're gonna talk about how you can shoot this to set yourself up for success. Next, we're gonna go into After Effects and talk about tracking, rotoscoping, and a few little compositing tricks to make this look as real as possible. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so here we are in Adobe After Effects. As you can see, I already have my footage imported, and I'm just gonna take a quick second to go over each of these two shots. The first play is going to be our stationary one, where we have our actor climbing out the window of his truck onto the roof of his car and acting out his little surfing performance. Now, when we shot this, you can see I'm actually going around to climb on the hood of his truck with the leaf blower to hit him with a little bit of wind, which mainly came in handy for when he first climbed out, getting his hat to blow off. This is the most important shot to make sure this effect is successful, and there's just a few things we need to keep in mind. The first is going to be matching the perspective of this truck to what it's going to be later when we're filming from the car on the freeway. Now, I knew I wanted to be in the left lane while my friend Parker was in the right, so I offset the camera over to the left so we could see this whole side. The second is going to be matching the height that you shoot this at. As you can see from this little angle, I set up my camera to roughly be as tall as my phone was going to be while I was filming from my car. And the last thing to keep in mind is going to be the angle of your lighting. The reason his truck is sideways in the road right here is because that's the direction the freeway is actually facing way down the road over here. So that way when we composite this later, the sun is hitting him and his truck from the same angle it's going to be while we're driving. So if you're trying to recreate this yourself, make sure you keep those three things in mind and don't actually have your friend climb out onto the roof of their car on the freeway, because that would be a bad idea. But if you do, make sure you tag me so I can see that. But with those three things taken care of, now it's time to talk about the car shot. Now for this shot, I opted to film it on my phone just to make it seem as organic as possible, as if I'm just documenting a crazy driver that's in front of me. I've intentionally let my camera be a little bit shaky, and I even added in a bit of a zoom that we can track later just to give it a bit more personality. Now you'll notice the angle of this truck and this one aren't exactly matching, and ideally you'd get that a little bit closer, but these two shots are going to work together just fine, so we can go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is grab the plate of the truck while it's static and drag it down here to this icon to create a new composition. And let's go ahead and cut out just the part of this that we want to use. So I'm thinking probably starting it about here. And a quick handy little shortcut to trim this over to your playhead without having to drag it is just to hit Alt open bracket to bring this to where your playhead is. And then we can scrub to the end when he climbs back into the truck and hit Alt close bracket to do the same on the other side. Now we can bring this clip to the beginning of our composition, drag in the work area, and if you hold Shift, it'll snap to the end of the clip. And then we can right click and choose Trim Comp to Work Area. And just because I think these high frame counts are a little bit annoying, I'm also going to right click on my comp, go to Composition Settings, and then reset the start frame down to 0. This doesn't do anything other than I just like seeing the actual true number of frames rather than that really high number that came from the camera. The next thing we're going to do is rotoscope him and the top of his truck out. But to make my life a little bit easier, I don't want to be working in 4K since I don't need this entire frame to be processed when we're working with Rotobrush. So I'm actually going to go back to the comp settings, check this lock aspect ratio, and then we can change the width from 3840 to 1920. And then I'm going to slide this clip over so we're just seeing the actor and the top of his truck. Let's make sure his head doesn't get cut off. About there, looks pretty good. Now I'm going to come over here to the project panel and find our composition. Click it and hit Enter on the keyboard and just rename this to Crop, since this is where we've zoomed in and cropped in on our clip. Now let's drag Crop down here into a new composition. Now let's go ahead and rename this one also to Roto. Here in our Roto comp, we can come up here to the toolbar and select our Roto brush. And now double click on this layer inside the composition to open it up to start rotoing. Go to the middle of the clip, somewhere where your actor is pretty much fully visible, and let's start drawing over him with this roto brush. If you're in After Effects 2025 and using the newest version of the Rotobrush, you'll notice that this thing feels almost like magic. It doesn't take as much refining as it did in previous iterations, so this step should go pretty quick. I'm going to zoom into some key areas here, and if you hold Alt, you'll actually change it from a plus to a minus so we can subtract out areas that we don't want. When you're getting small little areas like fingers, sometimes your Rotobrush might be a little bit too big, so a quick way to adjust that is hold Control and then left click and hold, and you can drag left and right with your mouse to increase or decrease the size of this brush. Let's get these fingers here. And again, we can hold Alt, and I'm just going to get rid of this extra area that it grabbed under his arm. I'm going to make sure to get his foot and not let too much of his ankle get cut off here down at the bottom. Now I'm pretty happy with that selection, so I'm going to go ahead and hit space to let this start playing forward. And you can see it grabs our actor almost like magic. You can pause it if you need to and come in and refine if it ever grabs something extra or loses part of your actor that you need to stay within the selection, but so far none of that has happened and we can just let this keep playing. Now that I've got the back half of this clip, I'm going to do the same thing and just go through the first half, going a few frames at a time and just making sure that our selection stays consistent. Once you're finished going through and you're happy with your selection, you can go ahead and click this button here to freeze your Rotobrush so it doesn't just try and continually update in the background as we're working on this shot. Once that's finished processing, this bar is going to turn blue, indicating that it is in fact frozen, so we can click up here to go back to our composition, and then we can start adjusting the settings within our Rotobrush effect. Now, I don't want it to be quite as sharp of an edge, so I'm going to lower the contrast to, say, around 25%. And then I'm going to check this button that says Use Motion Blur, which is going to allow some of these edges to blur out when it interpolates that it's moving rather quickly. Now next, let's scroll up and click this arrow to collapse this, and then let's hit Control D to duplicate it, and on the bottom copy, let's delete the Rotobrush. Now go further in your timeline until your actor is actually on top of the car so we can see the full outline. We just don't want him blocking some of the edge like this because we want to be able to cut out this truck. So later in the timeline, we're going to right click, go to Time and select Freeze Frame. And then we're going to grab our mask pen tool at the top and start going around the outside edge of this truck and cut out the top of it. This step is pretty important, so feel free to take your time and make sure you're as accurate as possible, going around all of the different areas like the mirror and these top grates up here. Now I don't actually need the whole back of the truck, so I'm going to kind of cut through something like this. I'm going to keep some of the door and then come up here around the top and finish off the mask. And let's not forget to cut out the inside of this little mirror pocket. I'm going to hit M on the keyboard to reveal my two masks and set this second one to subtract. And now I can hit F to bring up the feather properties, and I'm going to give them both a feather of around 2 or 3 pixels. Nothing dramatic, just a little bit to soften up the edges. And now that we've got this all cut out, we can go ahead and go back to the project panel, grab our second shot, the one of the car driving down the road, and drag it down here to make another new composition. Now the first thing we're going to need to do in this composition is track this truck. So in order to do that, we're going to come up here to the Effects dropdown, go to Boris Effects Mocha and add Mocha AE. First, make sure your comp is set to full, otherwise Mocha will give you a warning, and then click this Launch Mocha AE button. Now here in Mocha, we're going to zoom into the truck, grab the X spline tool, and then draw a little shape including the window, the door, and a little bit of the back of the truck with the taillights. And then when we're done drawing the shape, we're going to right click to stop and close it. Now we can click this button over here on the left to analyze forward, and just let this take a minute to process all the way through the clip. Now once that's finished, we can click this X in the top right corner, press Save, and then let's go to the Tracking Data dropdown in the Effects panel and click this button that says Create Track Data. Now we need something to attach the tracking data to. So let's come up here to Layer, go to New, and choose Null Object. Now back on the car shot layer, we can change the export option from corner pin to transform, and then change the layer export from none to our null, and then click Apply. Now next, let's go over to our project panel, and let's drag in our roto composition above the car shot layer. And now for the next step, let's go ahead and scale this down and position this roughly in place where it lines up with the truck. Next, we can use the parent link pick whip to select our null, and if we scrub through this clip, we should see this top layer accurately locked onto the footage below it. The next thing we need to do is arguably the hardest part of this effect, but even still, it's not going to be too bad. We just got to go through and using some masks, maybe some mesh warp and a few keyframes, get this top truck to as accurately as possible line up with the one below it. So immediately I know that we're going to slide this over. Look at how much smaller this mirror is than the one below it. So let's scale it up so they're at least pretty close to each other. Because of the perspective, this whole bed of the truck is way off from where it needs to be. So I'm going to grab my mask pen tool and just draw a mask like this and chop off the back of the truck. Hit M on the keyboard and change this to subtract. Hit F to bring up the feather properties. And let's just increase this to maybe around like 80, 90 pixels. I'm going to rotate this a little bit because you can see the angle between the two grates at the top is off. So maybe like that looks pretty good. Maybe we can scale this down just a little bit more. While we're doing this, we can also hit T on the keyboard and drop the opacity so you can kind of see both trucks at the same time. Sometimes that's a little bit helpful. Now, I think I got this pretty well lined up, as good as I'm going to get with position, scale, and rotation. So let's come over here to the right where it says Effects and Presets. If you don't see that, you can come up here to Window and make sure that the Effects and Presets tab is checked on. Open up this dropdown and let's search for Mesh Warp. Drag Mesh Warp out onto your roto layer. And then we can use the intersections of each of these little points on this grid to warp the layer to get it to match just that much closer. We don't want to be too extreme on this step because obviously if we pull things way out of position, you're going to be able to tell this truck is distorted. So be nice and subtle with it, balancing position, scale, and rotation of the layer with mesh warp wherever it's needed until you can get these to at least semi-accurately line up, enough so you can't tell all that much when you zoom out. Now, I think that's lined up pretty good. The last thing I want to do, though, is draw a mask around this back grate, because if you look really close, you can see the outline of this leaf blower here, and I'd rather see through the original truck. So again, let's select the roto layer, grab your mask tool, and let's just draw a rectangular shape around the back grate. Hit M, set this to subtract, hit F, and feather it out probably around 30 or 40 pixels. Now, I know from doing this last time that when we zoom in and out, there is a little bit of slip on the track. So in order to fix that, what I'm going to do is go to right when the zoom finishes, right about here, select our roto layer, go to the effects controls, and then let's add a keyframe on distortion mesh on this frame. So we can go back in the timeline to right as the zoom starts, and then again play with our mesh warp layer to line this back up where it needs to be with the truck, so that way the slipping on the track isn't all that obvious. Now, I think this is looking pretty good so far, except we've got one very obvious problem, and that's that the colors between these two layers don't match. So in order to fix that, what we need to do is click our roto layer and let's add an effect called levels. So again, over here in the effects and presets, we'll search for the levels effect, drag this out onto the roto layer, and then we'll start adjusting this effect over here until it matches more accurately in our composition window. One thing I like to do when matching the color between two different layers is change my channels to isolate the red, green, and blue and match those individually one at a time. So if I change this to red, we can change our levels effect to red, and then play with this slider until these two colors appear to be the same as one another, maybe somewhere around right there. Now we can go to the green channel, change the levels to green, and do the exact same thing. And lastly, we'll go to blue, change levels to blue, and brighten this up here. Change it back to RGB, and you can see if we toggle this levels on and off that we've done a pretty good job already, and it didn't take very long at all. Now, just from looking at this, I think we're really close, but we could use a little more refinement. So I'm going to come back over to the Effects and Presets panel and search for an effect called Color Balance. Let's drag that out below our levels, and I'm going to decrease the red highlights and then maybe increase the blue shadows just a touch. And lastly, if we zoom in and look at the footage of the truck and the footage of our guy is definitely a bit too sharp. So let's add a fast box blur. So let's search over here for fast box blur. Drag this below the color balance. And let's set the blur radius to 1.5. That should work pretty good. And now that we've got this tracked, we've got the colors to match, the trucks line up, we're pretty much done, except there's just a couple more things we're gonna take care of first. When I whip pan down at the end, the track slips completely because Mocha was no longer able to keep the truck in frame. So in order to fix that, what I'm gonna do is select my null, hit U on the keyboard, and then using page up and page down, I'm gonna go frame by frame until the very last frame that it's locked on, and then use this slider at the bottom to zoom in. I'm gonna click and drag and delete all of my keyframes that go after our last good keyframe, and then I'm gonna go frame by frame and move my null one frame at a time until the truck is completely gone. We can scale it as well, or go back to our mesh warp effect and add more keyframes. But if I zoom out here, I think that looks pretty good. Now next, let's grab these 3 layers all together and hit Control-Shift-C to pre-compose them. And I'm gonna call this Composite, because this is where we did our compositing effects. Now in this comp, I'm gonna add a little bit of camera shake and a little bit of extra color correction to further blend these layers together. So for the camera shake, we're actually gonna do it the simplest way possible in After Effects. We're gonna scale up our layer so there's a bit of extra going out around the outside. Otherwise, once this moves around, we'd get a black border. So again, let's scale it up. Hit P on the keyboard to reveal the position property, and then Alt-click on this stopwatch to create an expression. Now let's type wiggle, open parentheses, 3, 10. What this is saying is 3 times a second, wiggle randomly 10 pixels. So obviously you could adjust this to your liking. You could say 10 times a second, wiggle 100 pixels, but just so you know what those 2 numbers mean. And then we can come back over to the effects and presets and type in Lumetri and drag out the Lumetri color effect, drop open the basic correction, and let's add a little more contrast, maybe increase the temperature to make the clip a little warmer, maybe decrease the tint so it's a little bit green, might look kind of cool. Let's crush the blacks just a hair, decrease the shadows, and we could also drop down this creative and start going through some of these preset LUTs and find something that looks cool. Maybe one of these film stocks might add a little bit of personality to this, but I don't want it to be too intense, so I'll drop this intensity slider down to like 25%. All right, and there you have it, a completed effect of the dude climbing out of his car window and surfing down the freeway. Hope you learned something. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to leave me a comment and I will get back to you. Or you can hit me up over on X or Twitter, whatever you prefer to call it these days, at Jacob Dalton VFX. And with that being said, hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one.